Israel had a problem, which is it had expelled a very significant number of Palestinians, and it was very worried about them coming back. And in practice, its concerns, it had a small number of Palestinians still here. Its concerns are rather similar to those of a cowboy on the plains of the US. I don't know if you have similar kind of cowboys in Canada, but how does a cowboy know that these are his cattle and those are somebody else's cattle? What does he do to make sure he knows which one are his?
Brands.
He brands them, exactly. And this was Israel's effectively its solution as well. It needed to know which Palestinians it had inside the borders and which ones were outside. And so it branded them. It didn't brand them with citizenship, it branded them with residency. Gave them temporary residency while it decided what it was going to do. Now, under pressure from the United Nations, slowly this residency gets converted into citizenship. Not immediately. Some of the people we call Palestinian citizens today didn't get their citizenship till 1980. It was a process that went on over quite some time. But this was essentially the problem for Israel. It was important first to know who was still inside the borders and who was out. The second problem was to stop anyone who was outside the borders coming back in. And therefore it had to come up with a series of solutions to that problem. The first thing it did is it classified anybody who tried to come over the border as an infiltrator. This new classification, they weren't people trying to get back to their homes, they were infiltrators. And if you were classified as an infiltrator, if you tried to cross over the border, this infiltration law effectively allowed you to shoot somebody. If you were you had a weapon and you were an Israeli, you were allowed to shoot them on the spot, and there'd be no questions asked. So it was a sort of shoot to kill policy, anybody who tried to cross over the border. That eventually became the Prevention of Infiltration Law. That was the first obstacle to make it difficult. The second one was to make sure there was nothing to come back to. And so Israel erased the homes, it destroyed them. 530 of these villages, they're destroyed. So that when if the refugees thought about coming back, there was nothing actually to come back to. Now there's a further problem. It's possible that refugees might come back and try and rebuild their houses. These are fairly simple stone structures. It's not impossible to rebuild these things. So there were other tools necessary, obstacles needed to be placed in their way. One of them was to declare these areas, seal them off with a fence, as we can still see, probably the original fence, I don't know, it's a pretty old fence, but they fenced off areas, and then declare these areas closed military zones. You're probably aware that there are closed military zones in the occupied territories. Well, again, the template for that was here. They started with these closed military zones. All of these destroyed villages became closed military zones. And if you crossed over the fence, you became an infiltrator. As I've already explained, if you're an infiltrator, it was a shoot-to-kill policy, no questions asked. Now, this is still a closed area. You're still not supposed to go in there. I don't think if you crossed over you'd be shot dead. I don't think that sort of thing goes on anymore. But, just to give you a sense of it, I have a friend who was doing her PhD on the destroyed villages, and she came to a village very similar to this one, not this one, but one like it. And she came with a refugee from the village, and he, like most refugees, wanted to show her where his family house had been. So he said, let's go over and we'll find it. So they went inside this closed area, and within 5 minutes the police had arrived and they'd been arrested. So it's still in force, it's still a closed area. You won't get shot, but you will get arrested if you go in there and you don't have permission to go in there. So these fences demarcate a closed area, another obstacle course in this, stopping Palestinians refugees from trying to access their houses. Now another part of this was planting these forests. Because once there's a forest, when there's a tree growing through where your house is, it's much harder to rebuild it, of course. But the forests are there for various reasons. Now, they're planted by this organisation I've mentioned before, this Zionist charity, the Jewish National Fund. We've got to think about this, that the Jewish National Fund is a charity. If you make a donation to it, it's tax deductible. It operates as a charity in most Western countries, in most of Europe, in America, in Canada, and so on. But the Jewish National Fund's role here is to enforce the dispossession of the refugees. And to enforce a war crime, what we're seeing here, of course, is a war crime, and to enforce it and then to conceal it. The other part of this, of course, is to conceal the war crime. And the trees and the forests are a large part of that function. So much of the money that was raised by the Jewish National Fund, tax-deductible money that was raised, charitable money, was used to plant these forests. That's where the money went. Now, the forests serve several functions. Why choose these trees? I mean, it's the choice of tree here that reveals quite a lot as well. These trees are chosen. They're mostly there are a few varieties of pine that are indigenous to this area, to this region, but most of these pines are imported. They're not from this area, and certainly they don't grow in these kinds of forested conditions. So Israel chooses this. Now, when they plant these forests of trees like this, the primary function was to conceal the war crime. That's why you choose these trees, because they're pine trees, they're fast growing and they're evergreen. So they quickly cover up the war crime and they give you round year cover. Now these forests aren't, this particular forest isn't looking the way it looked when I first came here 15 years ago. It's been much thinned out. And one has to ask, why has it been thinned out? And nobody's written about this, but I can guess why it has been. And this is related. This is related to the Carmel forest fire in 2010. Some of you may remember there was this huge raging forest fire up on the Carmel mountain next to Haifa. It was on the TV, and Israel was really frightened that Haifa was going to burn down, and it was saved by the Turks actually. The Turkish lent these big water carrying planes, had these underbellies that open and all the water drops out. Israel doesn't have this kind of equipment, and so these were used and put out the fire just before it sort of singed the edges of Haifa. Now there are 3 destroyed villages up on the Carmel mountain, that's why there's a forest there, just like there was here. And Israel had planted a thick forest up there to conceal the remains of the destroyed villages. And because these trees are highly flammable, they're not really suited to these very dry conditions in the summer, somebody just needs to throw a cigarette out the window and the whole thing goes up. This is the problem. And Israel learnt a very painful lesson there, and I think it's been applying that lesson since. So forests like this have been really thinned out, because in a sense they've served their function. Israel isn't too worried about concealing the war crimes now. Most people have forgotten about that. They think it's history and an old story. But certainly in the 50s and 60s, this would have been a dense canopy. It would have all been very dark and murky in there. It would have been a very useful way of concealing what had happened in there. There's also another aspect of these trees that's worth thinking about. I told you that the new immigrants that moved into this moshav here were from Romania and Bulgaria. Like many of these kinds of communities, they were bringing in new immigrants from Eastern Europe and putting them into these kinds of communities to Judaize the land. This is all about Judaization again, of course. So for them, most of what they're looking at would have looked fairly alien. They wouldn't have seen palm trees and olive trees and all these citrus trees in wherever they were coming from, Romania and Bulgaria. These pine trees would have looked much more familiar to them, much more homely. So there was a psychological element probably to planting these forests as well. Now, a last part of the equation to be thinking about when we think about these forests is also they're very aggressive trees. There are Israeli studies, an academic who wrote a very interesting book trying to compare the relationship between the trees, what the trees were doing and what the new immigrants were doing. They were doing something very similar. They were both Judaizing the land quite aggressively to dispossess Palestinians. And it's interesting, these kinds of trees, pine trees, the pine needles, when they fall to the ground, they acidify the soil, making it inhospitable to other kinds of plants. Now, when we think about what was here before these kinds of forests, not necessarily here where the houses were, but also the Jewish National Fund planted large forests over large areas that weren't, which were being used for other purposes. If we think about what kind of trees were here before the pine tree, if we think about what were the kind of native trees of this area, it's interesting. Here, let me go through a few of them. There were olive trees, there were citrus trees, there were nut trees, pecans, walnuts, almonds, cherry trees, pomegranate trees, carob trees. See any connection between all those trees? They're all produce bearing. They all have something that you can eat. And this was actually a vital part of the Palestinian diet. These were poor peasant communities in the main, living off agriculture. So they needed, as an important part of their diet, was foraging from these trees. That was part of their subsistence. So if Israel strips out these trees, takes them away and plants these useless pine trees, it's also depriving them of an essential part of their diet, of their ability to subsist on the land. So that was part of the story here as well. So in all these different ways, it was making life very difficult for any refugee that tried to get back, found there was no house. If they entered it, they were likely to be shot, and there was nothing to live off. Not only was there no house, but there was nothing for them to sustain themselves. So really, this became very difficult for the refugees. So the refugees, it was a big disincentive for coming back.